On a busy, chaotic road filled with blaring horns and indifferent pedestrians, a small, battered child collapses to the ground. His frail body is covered in bruises, his cries drowned out by the noise around him. People glance, but keep walking, ignoring the desperate pain etched across his face. A nearby police officer looks on, but does nothing, his attention focused elsewhere. But then, out of nowhere, he appears. Keanu Reeves steps out of the crowd, his sharp gaze locking onto the injured boy. Without hesitation, he rushes to the child's side, his hands trembling slightly as he checks for injuries. His eyes reflect both compassion and urgency as he cradles the child gently. The world seems to fade into the background as Keanu, now the boy's only hope, springs into action. What follows is a story of humanity, courage, and the lengths one man will go to protect a child abandoned by the world. Around him, the day was loud, chaotic, and relentless. The scorching sun beat down on the city streets, where cars honked impatiently, their drivers shouting over the hum of an indifferent crowd. Amongst the chaos, no one noticed the small figure stumbling down the side of the road. A 10-year-old boy, his school uniform torn and stained with dirt and blood, clutched his arm tightly as he staggered forward. His face was pale, streaked with tears, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He tried to call out for help, but his voice was drowned by the roar of engines and the buzz of people passing by. He finally collapsed near the curb, his knees giving out beneath him. His fragile body hit the pavement hard, and a faint cry escaped his lips. A few people turned their heads, their gazes lingering for a moment before they looked away and carried on with their day. To them, he was just another problem someone else would deal with. A police officer stood nearby, leaning against his car with a cup of coffee in hand. He glanced at the boy briefly, frowned, and then returned to scrolling through his phone. It wasn't his problem. The boy's sobs grew louder, though they were no match for the noise of the street. His tiny hands trembled as he tried to wipe away the blood trickling from his forehead. His eyes darted around, filled with fear and desperation. He was alone. That was when he appeared. Through the bustling crowd, Keanu Reeves emerged. Dressed casually, he had been on his way to a meeting. When he spotted the boy, his pace slowed, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the child lying on the ground. For a moment, Keanu's expression softened, and then it hardened with resolve. He broke into a run, weaving through the crowd until he reached the boy. Kneeling beside him, he gently touched the child's shoulder. "Hey, buddy," Keanu said softly, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos around them. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" The boy's tear-filled eyes met Keanu's, and he whimpered, clutching at his injured arm. Keanu's heart clenched at the sight. He carefully examined the child's injuries, his movements deliberate yet gentle. The police officer nearby glanced over again, this time with curiosity, but he made no move to help, sipping his coffee instead. Keanu's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes as he noticed the officer's indifference. Without a second thought, he scooped the boy into his arms, holding him close. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I've got you. You're safe now." As he stood, the weight of the boy in his arms felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just the physical weight. Keanu could feel the burden of neglect, the pain of being ignored by a world too busy to care. The bustling street began to fade into the background as Keanu made his way toward safety, the child clinging to him like a lifeline. What Keanu didn't know was that this moment was only the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would test his compassion, courage, and humanity like never before. Keanu carried the boy through the sea of bustling traffic and disinterested passers-by, his arms steady, but his mind racing. The boy's small body felt frail in his grasp, trembling with every labored breath. Keanu's focus was solely on him, blocking out the honking horns and murmurs of strangers. He glanced down at the child's face, tear-streaked, pale, and twisted in pain. "What happened to you, kid?" Keanu asked gently, though he didn't expect an answer. The boy whimpered, clutching his injured arm tighter. His voice was barely audible, a broken whisper. They hurt me." Keanu's heart sank, but his resolve hardened. "Who hurt you?" The boy didn't answer. His eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion taking over. Keanu pushed forward, spotting a nearby diner. He burst through the doors, the bell jangling loudly. The chatter inside died instantly as patrons turned to stare at the unexpected sight of a movie star carrying a bloodied, crying child. "Someone get me a first aid kit." Keanu's voice was firm, commanding the room. A waitress rushed forward, her hands trembling as she handed him a small kit from behind the counter. I'll call an ambulance," she stammered, grabbing the phone. "Thank you," Keanu said, already kneeling on the floor to set the boy down gently on a booth bench. He worked quickly, cleaning the cuts on the boy's face and hands with a damp cloth. "You're safe now," he murmured, more to himself than the boy, as he bandaged a particularly deep cut on the child's forehead. The boy stirred, opening his eyes briefly. "Don't let them find me," he mumbled weakly. Keanu froze. "Who's them?" Before the boy could respond, the diner door slammed open. A police officer strode in, the same one who had ignored the boy on the street. His face was a mix of irritation and indifference. "Hey, Reeves," the officer called, his tone dismissive. "What's all this about? You making a scene over a kid?" Keanu stood slowly, his tall frame towering over the officer. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with restrained anger. "This boy is injured, and you stood there doing nothing," Keanu said, his voice low but firm. "How many people walked past him because they thought it wasn't their problem? How many more would have ignored him if I hadn't stepped in?" The officer scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Relax, man. It's just a kid. These things happen. He'll be fine." Keanu took a step forward, his presence commanding. "It's not just a kid. This is someone's child. He's hurt, scared, and needs help, and you were too busy drinking coffee to care." The officer opened, his mouth to argue, but the arrival of the ambulance cut him off. Paramedics rushed in, their voices calm and professional as they assessed the boy's condition. Keanu stayed by the child's side, his hand resting gently on the boy's uninjured shoulder. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. "I promise." As the paramedics prepared to take the boy to the hospital, Keanu turned back to the officer. "You had a chance to do the right thing, but you didn't? That's on you." The officer shifted uncomfortably, but Keanu didn't wait for a response. He followed the stretcher out to the ambulance, determined not to leave the boy alone. As the ambulance doors closed, Keanu's mind raced with questions. Who had hurt this child? Why was he left alone in the street? And most importantly, how could he make sure it never happened again? This wasn't just about saving one boy. This was about standing up for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And Keanu Reeves wasn't about to back down. The ambulance sped through the city streets, its siren wailing as Keanu sat beside the boy, his hand gently holding the child's smaller one. The paramedics worked swiftly, cleaning and bandaging wounds while monitoring his vitals. The boy's Eyes fluttered open every few moments, but his exhaustion kept pulling him under. Keanu leaned closer, his voice soft but urgent. "Can you tell me your name, kid?" The boy hesitated, his voice barely a whisper. "Eli." Keanu smiled faintly. "Eli, that's a strong name. Don't worry, Eli. We're going to make sure you're safe." As the ambulance pulled into the hospital, Keanu stepped out first, helping the paramedics guide the stretcher. A team of doctors and nurses was already waiting, their movements precise and efficient as they whisked Eli inside. Keanu watched them go, his jaw tightening. He didn't like the idea of leaving Eli alone, but he knew the doctors needed space to do their job. Still, he wasn't going anywhere until he had answers. Moments later, a nurse approached him, her face a mix of confusion and concern. "Mr. Reeves, the boy's injuries are consistent with abuse. We've already notified social services." Keanu's stomach churned. "Abuse? Are you sure?" The nurse nodded grimly. "Bruises in various stages of healing, malnourishment. He's been through a lot." She paused, lowering her voice. "And there's something else. He keeps mumbling about them. Do you have any idea who he's talking about?" Keanu's eyes narrowed. "No, but I'm going to find out." He turned and made his way to the waiting room, pulling out his phone. If no one else was going to step up for Eli, he would. He started calling his connections, reporters, investigators, anyone who could help him dig into this boy's life and uncover the truth. An hour later, as Keanu waited for news, a disheveled woman stormed into the hospital. Her eyes were wild, and her face was streaked with tears. "Where's my son? Where's Eli?" Keanu immediately stood, his body tense. "You're Eli's mother?" The woman nodded frantically. "Yes, I've been looking for him all day. Please, where is he?" Something about her demeanor didn't sit right with Keanu. "He's being treated," he said carefully. "But I need to ask, how did he end up on the street, injured and alone?" The woman's expression faltered, and she took a step back. I don't know. He must have run off. He does that sometimes." Keanu crossed his arms, his voice firm. "Eli told me someone hurt him. He's terrified, and the doctors think he's been abused. Do you know anything about that?" Her face paled, and she shook her head vigorously. "No! I would never hurt my son. You don't understand. He's clumsy, always getting into trouble." Keanu's sharp gaze never left hers, and the room grew heavy with tension. Before he could press further, a social worker arrived, her presence calm but authoritative. "Mr. Reeves, we'll handle this from here. Thank you for bringing Eli in." Keanu hesitated, his instincts telling him there was more to the story. But he nodded, stepping aside to let the professionals do their work. As he left the hospital, his mind was a storm of emotions. He knew this wasn't the end. Eli needed more than just medical treatment. He needed justice, safety, and someone to fight for him. Keanu pulled out his phone again, dialing a trusted contact in law enforcement. "Detective, it's Keanu. I need your help. There's a boy named Eli at St. Mark's Hospital. Something's not right, and I want to get to the bottom of it." As he hung up, Keanu's resolve deepened. Whoever had hurt Eli, whoever had left him to suffer, they weren't going to get away with it. Keanu Reeves wasn't just a bystander. He was a protector, and he wasn't going to stop until Eli's story had the ending it deserved. "You said," the following day, Keanu returned to the hospital. He was greeted by the same nurse who gave him a reassuring nod. "Eli's stable now. He's awake, and he's been asking for you." Keanu's heart softened. He followed the nurse to Eli's room, where the boy sat up in bed, his small frame still fragile but his eyes brighter than before. "Keanu!" Eli's voice trembled with relief as Keanu stepped inside. "Hey, buddy," Keanu said, sitting beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" Eli shrugged, his fingers nervously fidgeting with the hospital blanket. "Better, but scared." Keanu leaned closer, his voice gentle. "Eli, I need you to be brave for me. Can you tell me who hurt you? I want to help, but I need to know the truth." Tears welled up in Eli's eyes, and his small voice cracked as he spoke. "It was my mom's boyfriend. He hates me. He says I'm a problem and that I make her life worse." Keanu clenched his jaw, fighting the anger rising within him. "Does your mom know?" Eli nodded weakly. "She knows, but she says we don't have anywhere else to go." Keanu placed a comforting hand on Eli's shoulder. "You don't have to go back there, Eli. I promise you, we'll make sure you're safe." As Eli rested, Keanu stepped out to meet with Detective Carter, the officer he had called the previous night. The detective had already launched an investigation. "We've questioned the mother and her boyfriend," Carter informed him. "The boyfriend has a record of domestic violence. We've placed Eli under protective custody while we gather more evidence." Keanu's relief was palpable, but he wasn't done yet. "I want to make sure Eli has a future. He needs more than just safety. He needs love, stability, and a chance to heal." Carter nodded. "We'll work with social services to find him a good foster home. But if you want to stay involved, we can make that happen." Keanu didn't hesitate. "I'm not going anywhere. Eli deserves to know someone cares." Days turned into weeks, and Keanu remained by Eli's side through every step of the process. He helped the boy transition into a loving foster home, ensuring he was surrounded by people who valued and supported him. One afternoon, as Keanu visited Eli in his new home, the boy ran up to him, clutching a handmade drawing. It showed Keanu as a superhero, holding Eli in his arms. "This is for you," Eli said, smiling shyly. "Because you saved me." Keanu knelt down, his eyes misting as he looked at the drawing. "You're the brave one, Eli. Don't ever forget that." In the months that followed, Eli began to thrive, his wounds, both physical and emotional, starting to heal. And while Keanu eventually returned to his life in Hollywood, he kept in touch with Eli, ensuring the boy knew he always had someone in his corner. For Keanu, the experience was a reminder that true heroism wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And for Eli, it was the beginning of a new chapter filled with hope, love, and the knowledge that he mattered.